this is a little detour. Biology and causation is completely irrelevant to what you do as service providers. You know, if green Martians can be coming down and like shooting gamma rays into heads and causing this, it doesn't matter to you. At the end of the day, you have someone walk in the door, you have to serve them, no matter if it was caused by fetal alcohol syndrome, or if it was caused by encephalitis, or if it was a genetic defect. You don't care, right? You don't care. And you shouldn't care. On the other hand, given the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing, these questions are very important, and people who work with this population should think about them. Now, what is autism biologically? It's not one thing. I mean, we really don't know. If we knew what it was biologically, it would be so awesome, because we'd have a way to really diagnose it really well, and we might have a way to treat it really well, and we can get rid of all these other stupid therapies that aren't really working, but we don't really know. I mean, autism, as you know, presents different in different people, but underneath the clinical presentation, the biological reality seems to be very different, depending on who the person is. So, is there a bottom line? I think if you were to say there was one bottom line, and there's not, so this is fakery, it would relate to a certain part of your brain. So, brains are like these layer cakes, right? They're just layers and layers of neurons. So inside it's just parts of the brain, and within each part there's these layers and layers and layers of neurons. And kind of the icing on our human brain cake, the outer layer, is something called the cerebral cortex. I know, you know, there's one science person in here. Anybody else a science person?
I enjoy it. I enjoy it.
You enjoy it? That's good enough. Okay. Well, see, if there's a science person here, then I really have to like be on my guard. But now I know. This part of our brain, it's like these little microprocessors that we use to synthesize and integrate and process all this information from the outside world. You know, they come in to these little microprocessors, we microprocess it, we make sense of it, we connect, and then something comes out, right? That's how your normal brain works. But what if those microprocessors, these layers of the cerebral cortex, are not really connected very well? And you can't take it, you can absorb the information, you can perceive the information, but you can't quite weave it together. You can't quite process it. And so it goes in loops and loops and loops and loops. And it might reach out to touch another neuron, but it can't quite reach that other neuron to create a complete thought, right? Or to get to abstract from something tangible. That seems to be something that is happening with at least a subset of the people with autism. And this is from a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist. This is part of his work. And he says the end result of this mischief, where the neurons are connecting, is a failure of connection. Cells in the cerebral cortex are not able to coordinate their actions with other cells in their surroundings. I do think that on a fundamental biological level, this is what we're seeing in a lot of our autism population. Behavior is biology. It's biology. I can see the light, but my brain can't connect to tell me more about it. Like, a normal human brain can see the light and think of 1,000 things to associate that with. But my son will see the light and he'll just see the light. The thought will stop there. Of course, I can't say that for sure. I'm not in his brain, but having watched him, I mean, you can kind of surmise that. So, as a consequence of brain miswiring, what do we see in terms of impairments? Impairments in executive functioning. You guys know what executive functioning is?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Sensory processing, super important. We were just talking about my son getting overwhelmed in Hawaii. That happens like on a daily basis, I think, with people with autism. I think the failure of sensory processing should be in the diagnostic, should be in the DSM, honestly. Failure of abstract thinking and complex learning. They tend to be more literal thinkers, literal learners. Difficulties with social communication, which is the DSM. Repetitive behaviors, and sometimes also antisocial behaviors like aggression and self-injurious behavior or property destruction, and failure to develop proper self-help and daily adaptive skills. Now, when we looked at that graph, why autism was so much more expensive than the other categories, it's because these things are often intact with the other DD categories, right? I have a lot of friends with Down syndrome, and they're some of the sweetest, most incredible people. I love them so much. And they're nothing like my kids, right? They're both developmentally disabled, and it's like, you know, it's like different species. I mean, like you know, an ant and an elephant of difference, because they had these things. My kids don't have these things. It's a huge fundamental functional difference, and that's why these people are more challenging. So the rest of my presentation, which I'd like to be a little more interactive, I'm like, oh, you're fine. I'm okay. Is really going to take each one of these and talk about what does it mean for program. I also want to say I'm known as very much a pragmatic realist, and I am till the day I die. But that doesn't mean I don't have some heart. I do, actually. And I do want to say there's a lot of talk now about autism strengths, autism superpowers, the autism advantage in employment. Okay. I think a lot of that is like insane hype. At the same time, like every myth in the world, there's a grain of truth, right? A lot of people with autism do have particular strengths, and it is important to hone in on those. When we talked about repetitive behaviors, sometimes those repetitive behaviors are obsessive interests, and sometimes that can translate into a job strength, for example. And there are other strengths. With my kids, for example, they are the most loving, sweet, kind, gentle, beautiful souls you'll ever meet. Like, you would want to, even though Johnny has his challenges, you would want to hang out with him just because he's such a love bug. And it's absolutely true. They do have strengths. But you're in the business of serving people with a disability, right? And I am a realist. I don't ever deny the dis and disability. And we have to put it in perspective. All right. Oh, I did have one more slide on this, right? Okay. All right. I'm not really going to go into this, but quickly, you know, I forgot that I put this in. What causes autism? Right now, from a clinical perspective, only about 10% of cases can be attributed to genes. They think about 10% more they'll be able to find genetic causes for. Some people say another 10% on top of that. I'm skeptical. So maybe we'll get up to about 20% with an identifiable genetic basis. Maybe another 10, 15, 20% will have a known environmental basis. So what's an environmental cause of autism? For example, extreme prematurity has been associated with autism risk. Fetal valproate, so you guys know Depakote is an anticonvulsant. That's been associated with autism risk. You know, there some maternal infections. We know rubella, for example, was associated with autism risk. So there are some environmental causes that have been validated. It's not a huge number. It's really not. I would say 60 to 70% of cases today are still what are called idiopathic, which means we do not yet know the cause. All right? I mentioned I fund some cutting edge research and under my hat with the Escher Fund for Autism, I'm actually not going to talk about that because it's so complex. Your brains will be like, stop, Jill, this is too hard. If you're interested in this, I know Kathy passed something out that did relate to some of this work that I do. I will say this. I'm not a scientist, so I can say whatever I want and I don't get into any trouble. If I was able to place a bet on one factor that has been leading to the rise of autism, starting with births in the early 1980s, I would say one factor I'm reasonably certain is the generational consequence of pregnancy smoking that was intense after World War II. All right? Women were smoking like freaking chimneys, all right? Smoking all the time, pregnant. I remember this one mother said to me, her mom used to smoke and just put the ashtray on the big tummy, Women were prescribed smoking. Well, smoking causes lung cancer. Smoking causes heart disease. Smoking causes mutations. Causes mutations. Yes, it even causes mutations in what are called germ cells. Our little eggs, little sperm. It causes mutations, and those can have developmental consequences for the next generation that inherits those mutations. It's pretty complex stuff, but over the next couple of years, here's my $100. I'm going to be proven right about this. There's already been one study that has found this association. That was from a British study. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts about the impact of males smoking cannabis to their developmental years?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question. So cannabis is now really big. I even use it with my son. We'll talk about that in a minute. Smoking, interestingly enough, what is genotoxic about smoking tends not to be the fact of it being a cigarette or fact of it being a marijuana joint. It's the combustion. It's the products of combustion, the hundreds of toxic components. So you're going to have the same issues with cannabis smoking as you do with cigarette smoking because you're dealing with a combustion issue. What's different, I think, is the dose. You had people doing 2 packs a day, no problem. You do not see that with marijuana. You saw that with tobacco.
There's an inordinate focus on the maternal contribution.
And, okay.
So.
Very, very, very good question. All right, so yes, absolutely. There is a lot of work looking at the vulnerability of male sperm to certain toxicants, including tobacco. And does that increase the rate of mutations? Does it increase the risk of other problems in the sperm that could have a developmental effect on the next generation? You're absolutely right. In fact, I just helped fund a study. It was published, I think, in December, out of Florida. It was a mouse model, gave pre-conception males nicotine, and looked at the offspring results. And the offspring were more likely to have ADHD type characteristics. So the answer is yes, there is absolutely reason to be concerned. Another research group looked at that exact question with regard to smoking and mutations that are caused in sperm. And they think that probably globally, millions of cases of intellectual impairment are caused by paternal smoking. These are geneticists based in Canada who did that study. So yes, absolutely underappreciated, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, we always blame the mom.